Thanks, everybody, for being here and for inviting me to this conversation. I'm really excited to share my work here. And I've been listening to the talks from the Language and Brain group in the past and find them to be really stimulating. So I really look forward to the conversation here today. So as you saw in the title today, I will talk about adaptive speech perception. Before I start, I just want to quickly mention that my research interest focuses on how human beings understand spoken language, and I study both perception and production with a particular emphasis on cross-linguistic communication. And today I would like to focus on speech adaptation, right? So what do I mean by that? Let me start with an example that we can all sort of relate to. From time to time, we will encounter some talkers whose pronunciations do not quite align with what we expect to hear. And in the initial moments, we may find it difficult to follow their speech, and their speech may be a little bit confusing. But with time, we get better and their speech becomes more intelligible. And this kind of experience usually stand out when we talk to somebody with a speech disorder, or maybe someone who has a non-native accent and whose language background is not so familiar for us. But usually, more often, actually, this is part of the normal speech perception process. It usually goes without us even noticing that our interpretations of the same speech signal can actually not only depend on our long-term linguistic knowledge, but also our recent experience. And this kind of scenario is sort of exemplify that. And this captures the adaptivity of speech perception. One of the big open questions that my work aims to address is how does our long-term, possibly lifelong exposure to various types of different talkers, which is plotted here as colored dots, might be stored in a way that they can facilitate the adaptive speech perception in any given moment. And at the same time, how does each of these new instances of exposure to particular talkers feed back into and possibly change the representational knowledge that we have so that unfamiliar talker or accent will become more familiar and easier to process over time, right? So understanding these adaptive changes and how they occur in speech perception speak directly to our understanding or conceptualization of linguistic representations in my mind, as well as whether they are malleable throughout adulthood and the kind of neural architectures that support it. So even though I will focus on speech perception, I think we can ask similar questions about other aspects of linguistic processing. I know many of the people in the audience here study other aspects of language processing, and I hope the kind of a discussion that we have today will be of relevance to your work as well. So here's the roadmap for today. I would like to do the following things. First, I want to very briefly motivate why speech perception needs to be adaptive. And then I will present a selective overview of the rich empirical evidence that demonstrate that listeners do adapt, before turning to the deeper question, which is what is exactly adapted? That is, what kind of mechanisms support adaptation? I hope to convey to you that despite numerous empirical evidence, we actually know much less than what is currently believed by the field in terms of the kind of mechanisms that support the remarkable adaptivity of speech perception. And the insight I will share comes from the computational modeling work, as illustrated in one of the review papers that I shared ahead of time. I won't go into details of the modeling framework today, but I'm very happy to hear any feedback that you might have or any questions that you have if you have read the paper. And lastly, I will, to anticipate the part in this part, I'm going to argue that we need new sets of experiment design and new sets of data in order to address the mechanistic question. So among this, I think a better understanding or characterization of how adaptation occurs across timescales will be important. So I will present and seek feedback on the ongoing efforts that try to tackle the questions in this line of work. All right. So first of all, why does speech perception need to be adaptive? Well, the quick answer is variability abounds in speech. A common assumption behind theories of speech perception is that as we hear speech input, right, listeners extract phonetic cues from the signal, which are finally mapped to some kind of categories like D or T. And as such, we can recognize the intended meaning that's conveyed by a speaker. For instance, when we hear a token, we may be able to extract duration of the voice onset time or the fundamental frequency of a vowel onset, both of which are important cues to the voicing distinction. And this may help us to distinguish a sound, whether it's a D or T. But the problem is the categories produced by any given speaker does not correspond to these point estimates. Rather, they form distributions, right? Categories correspond to distributions. That means the mapping from the speech signal, any given token, to meaning is non-deterministic. And to make the problem worse, these kind of distributions will vary sometimes drastically across different talkers. And here on the screen, I'm showing you the production data from just 2 talkers. Both are native speakers of English. And we have the tokens of D and T plotted in the acoustic space along the VOT and F0 of voice onset, 2 cues that are important for voicing. As we can see that the token productions from these talkers are not the same, right? If I plot talker 1's D tokens together with the T tokens from another talker, it becomes clear that the same physical signal could mean a D for one talker and a T for another talker. This kind of crosstalk variability is pervasive in speech, and some of this originates from physiological differences between talkers, while others originate from like different language background, but also other social factors, including how we portray our identity. So in a sense, this variability is very important for social inferences, but on the other hand, it does pose a challenge for both machine speech recognition and human speech perception, because now we realize that the linguistic categories such as D and T, not only they form distributions over acoustic cues, but these distributions will vary across talkers. Intuitively, this means that our speech perception system must have a way to correct for these differences. Otherwise, it would have excessive uncertainty when comprehending speech. By some estimates, if speech perception is totally talker independent, then the recognition accuracy would be roughly around 68%, right? This means that 1 out of every 3 words we hear will be misrecognized, but this is certainly not what we experience. Somehow the speech perception manages to be talker dependent to allow us to correct for this kind of cross-talker differences. So how do we do that? Well, the research over the past 2 decades has identified that adaptive changes in speech perception occur, and they are a key component in listeners' ability to overcome the crosstalk variability, as I just showed you. And now let me illustrate this with a more concrete example. I'm going to play you some sound. I'm not sure whether everybody can hear it, but if you do, please let me know what you hear. And you can just unmute yourself or just speak loud.
What?
Do you hear anything?
Can you repeat it?
Okay.
What?
Did the sound play? Okay, I'm gonna play another one.
What?
The second one is a bit clearer.
Okay, what do you think it is?
What?
What? Okay, I'm gonna play you another sound.
Feed.
Feed. So this time it is intended to be F-E-E-D, ending E-D. And here's another one.
Feed.
Okay, so the last one is supposed to end in T. So you may get a sense that these tokens are a little bit confusing, right? The reason for that is because these are tokens from Mandarin accented talker who was speaking English, and some of the words may sound ambiguous. And part of the reason is that the D tokens in this accent sound a little bit like T's. And this is just one example of how natural accents can sometimes deviate from our long-term expectations in potentially very complex ways. And in this specific case, the reason why the Ds are confusing is because the non-native speaker did not use the same set of acoustic cues that are often employed by native listeners and native speakers. So for instance, if we look at this acoustic cue, the Q1 is very informative and helpful for distinguish D from T in the native accent, but in this non-native accent, its utility is much reduced, right? So if listeners continue to rely on the same set of cues, then they will experience some confusion. But fortunately, we know perception can be adaptive, and this is how we can test it in the lab. For instance, we can look at how exposure or the recent input can change how we interpret subsequent inputs using this exposure and test paradigm. And it usually works as such. During exposure, listeners will hear some sounds, and importantly, they will have the top-down information to help them to disambiguate the sounds, such as what you've heard, sort of ambiguous between D and T. For instance, they may hear a word like lemonade. I'm gonna play the sound of lemonade again.
Lemonade.
Okay, you may hear the word lemonade, but notice that the end D is a little bit different from what you expect. But crucially here, because listeners know what the word is intended to be, they will have anticipated that D is to occur by the end of the word. And if they have a lot of exposure to such words, then the idea is that they may use this knowledge to change how they perceive future input from the same talker, even though those input will be previously unheard of. And crucially, we can compare the performance in the test phase to another group where listeners would not have such exposure to the D words from this Mandarin accented talker, and they could be hearing other words from a native accented talker, or maybe they are hearing other words from the Mandarin accented talker just without the critical exposure to the D words. And then in the test phase, we will ask them to categorize words into D and T. For instance, when they hear a token, they will be asked to do the sort of task that you just did. Is it feed or feed, right? And by looking at the performance during the test phase, we would know whether the short-term exposure have any impact on how they perceive the same physical signal. And importantly, our hypothesis is that those who were in the L2 accented exposure condition, they will be able to learn how the sound should sound like in this novel accent, whereas those who do not have this critical exposure will have to rely on their long-term expectations, which is built upon exposure to native variants of the same category. So in other words, the L1 accented versus L2 accented condition here indicate what kind of expectations that listeners would rely on if they are in this exposure condition. It's not necessarily the case that they will actually hear the L1 accented type of speech in the L1 accented exposure condition, if that makes sense. So what we've discovered using this paradigm in the past is that we will see a difference between the two groups. Specifically, in those who are in the L1 accented exposure group, they will show relatively poor categorization accuracy for the D categories to begin with. Here shown in the blue bar on the left. Whereas with exposure to the L2 accent, then their recognition of the T category would improve without an equal decrease for the T category. As a result, overall, this means that listeners will be able to recognize the DT distinction more accurately as a function of the exposure to the L2 accented D tokens, right? And using this set of paradigm, we've now have collected very rich evidence demonstrating that listeners can quickly adapt to various kinds of talkers based on the recent input. And this works both for variation within the L1 accent, as well as more drastic deviations from one's long-term experience, like in unfamiliar L2 accents. And this works across different categories, across different languages, across different populations. And adaptation also sometimes generalized across talkers and the categories. And more importantly, these adaptation effects, they are not short-lived. If we have a delayed test after a few hours or even days, we still see the evidence of the adaptive changes, right? At this point, it is uncontroversial to say that our perception is adaptive, and exposure as such does alter the way we perceive subsequent inputs, mostly in the way that we get better at recognizing words despite the physical variability in the speech signal. And this has been given different names. Some people call it perceptual learning. Some people call it like talker accommodation, etc. But the question is, what is really adapted in these processes? So as I illustrated in the beginning, when we think about the process of speech perception, most of us think of a series of processes where we hear some input and then we ultimately make a decision, and we need to decide, for instance, whether we hear D or T, right? And in between is a series of latent processes that we cannot directly observe, but we think there are different stages between along this speech hierarchy, processing hierarchy. And in fact, in terms of accounting for the adaptive changes that we observed behaviorally speaking, adaptivity has been considered across the entire hierarchy. Specifically, first, there is a very long line of work that focuses on the low-level pre-linguistic normalization and compensation mechanisms, which remove a large amount of crosstalk variability, right? So this has been studied probably most prominently for vowels, but there are studies on fricatives and other types of categories as well. Common to all these proposals, the idea is that this pre-linguistic normalization happens very quickly, and they're sort of automatic, and they affect a particular cue regardless of what categories the cues are part of. For instance, if we normalize for the first, the second formant, then that affects all the vowels. And in contrast to this idea is the idea that maybe the way we navigate variability in speech is by storing or learning talker-specific cue to category mapping. And again, there are different types of proposals in this class, but common to all is the idea that we somehow learn and store something in our memory, the way different talkers sound. And later, when we encounter these talkers again, we will be able to retrieve that knowledge, and that allow us to perceive their speech more accurately. So from this perspective, there's some kind of a continuous learning that takes place throughout adulthood. And even what we usually refer to as like monolingual listeners, they may be able to hold multiple sets of representations of the same linguistic categories. So in brief, talker, where each accent is characterized by unique cue to category mapping that is stored in our memory. And lastly, other theories attributed the kind of adaptivity to the level of post-perceptual decision-making. So especially if you are familiar with the neuroimaging literature, then it is pretty common to distinguish between the changes that happen in the prefrontal areas that are responsible for integrating information to make a post-perceptual decision from the areas that are responsible for more earlier and lower levels of sound processing, including like the auditory cortex, right? So if this is the case, actually adaptivity does not have to result in any kind of changes in our linguistic representations. So with all this in mind, where we are as a field, well, on the one hand, there is much empirical evidence that has been argued to support each of the mechanisms that we talked about. And researchers often admit that there could be multiple sources of adaptivity. On the other hand, we don't usually consider this alternative hypothesis when we try to account for a particular phenomenon. For instance, for vowels, we often focus on pre-linguistic normalization. And in accounting for the type of L2 accent adaptation that I showed you earlier, we often start with the assumption that some kind of learning of the category representations need to take place, okay? So why does this matter? Why is this a problem? Well, we think it is a problem because when we build a theory on existing empirical data, if we only consider one mechanism, for instance, if we only consider the possibility of categorical representational changes to account for L2 accent adaptation, we actually do not know whether the same data can be equally explained by other mechanisms, right? In the sense, we don't really know if the evidence we have for a particular theory or a particular mechanism is exclusively supporting the theory. In that sense, the kind of theories we developed may be weak theories. So what do we need then? In our mind, as we summarized in the review paper, we need a framework that integrating the different classes of mechanisms, which would allow us to conduct more contrastive comparisons of different hypotheses and isolate individual contributions of these different mechanisms. So we developed this framework. This is work co-developed with Chigusa Kurumada and Florian Jaeger. So in this framework, what we call adaptive speech perception, for brevity, we try to implement models that predict changes underlying each of the different classes of mechanisms and specify how perception would change as a function of long-term exposure and recent input. So the ASP framework first formalizes the processes that listeners need to go through when hearing a speech input, and finally, how the listeners make a perceptual interpretation of a given input. And on top of that, we also implement the change models using the commonly shared assumptions within each class of the mechanisms that have been proposed in the past, and specify how changes in perception would occur as a function of recent exposure, right? So in a sense, our contribution is not that we proposed any new mechanism, rather we combine all three mechanisms together within one framework, and we specified how each mechanism may and can change as a function of the increasing amount of input. So just to give you the take-home message from this kind of a work, what we did is we conducted multiple case studies trying to simulate the empirical evidence that we have from multiple paradigms that are well established. And we discovered that actually all three types of mechanisms can qualitatively capture the signature patterns that we observe in behavioral experiments. Take again the L2 axon adaptation, for instance. We have this signature pattern, as I described to you earlier, using the kind of exposure test paradigm. And what we found is actually, even though L2 axon adaptation has commonly believed to be driven by changes in category representations, all three models actually can equally capture this pattern, right? In other words, we thought we have a good idea of what drives axon adaptation, but since we haven't considered the other alternative hypothesis, our conclusion may be premature. So the same thing goes for other types of signature patterns using different behavioral paradigms. What we discovered is that actually there's the possibility that multiple mechanisms are at play. Well, this idea is not surprising given the complexity of the speech perception and the functional demands that comes out of this complexity. But this does convey the sad message that we probably know much less than what we thought we knew about how adaptation occurs. So our insight, the insight from this modeling framework is that the current standards of experiment design and analysis are not well suited to tease apart these fundamentally different mechanisms. On the other hand, in order to determine when each mechanism is at play and how they may be combined or trade off to support a speech adaptation, we need new standards of empirical design and analysis, right? So we proposed some solution in the paper, which I will not go into detail, but I want to say that the case studies offer a lot of information about how we can use this framework as an analytical tool to identify when and how the distinct mechanisms are engaged. For instance, we can test if the same mechanism may be able to explain the extremely rapid adaptation, as we saw in those single exposure test paradigm. And after like 1 minute of exposure, or even 20 minutes of exposure, but we can also ask if the same mechanism can explain the behavioral data after 2 days of repeated exposure or repeated exposure that occur across a longer time span, like 1 month, right? So if we can collect more densely sample the adaptation trajectory, then we will have a better chance to say what kind of a mechanism best offer the account to the human data, and are there mechanisms that are jointly supporting adaptive speech perception or not. So the key insight that we got from this modeling framework is that the effectiveness of each of the change mechanism depends on 2 things, at least. One is the kind of acoustic phonetic features that help to shape our long-term prior expectations before we hear anything, and the acoustic phonetic properties of the exposure input that we get to hear in the kind of exposure test paradigms. So that is to say, it is very important for us to detail the link between the acoustic properties and the recognition over repeated exposure, which leads me to the last part of the talk, which is to study adaptation across time scales. So the overarching question of this line of work will be to answer how do listeners' response change over time across all these different time scales. Up to this point, a lot of studies have been conducted on the extremely shorter time scale, meaning scales of minutes. And there are also studies that look at how really, really long-term experience change the way we perceive things. For instance, we know a lot from sociolinguistic studies that long-term experience changes the way we perceive a sound. What we don't know is what happens in between, right? So in the rest of the talk, I will share you with ongoing efforts to address this question. And specifically, I'll share one study that investigates incremental adaptation in the moment and over a month's time, and another study that aims at understanding the interplay between short-term exposure and long-term experience with a focus on individual variation in sociolinguistic diversity. Okay. Before I delve into those 2 studies, I would like to see if there are any questions from the audience. Okay. If not, I'm going to continue. So the first study, we build upon this traditional exposure test paradigm that I described to you earlier. And now we build this new paradigm where we have repeated exposure and test, meaning we would interleave the exposure and test blocks together so that we can sample multiple times and see how listeners perceive the same speech signal as a function of exposure, right? So basically, we repeat the exposure multiple times and sample and do the phonetic categorization task multiple times to compare within subject changes over time. But one challenge that we encountered was that we know from past work that pronounced or repeated testing may reduce or undo exposure effects. So in order to do this study, we need to keep the test phase really brief. What we did is to select the stimuli from the previous set that I showed you in the past from Xie et al. 2017. And we use the model-guided approach to do the item selection. I'm happy to elaborate on that if anyone is interested. But basically, what we ended up with were 5 minimal pairs. So the test phase is extremely brief now. The question is whether we can get the same power to detect adaptation using this extremely brief test phase or not. This is our prediction. To begin with, we expect that everybody in both groups, they would have a better recognition of the T tokens relative to the D tokens. That's just what we expect to see for the Mandarin accented features. On top of that, we expect to see with this kind of incremental testing that only those participants who are in the L2 accented group will be able to improve their recognition of the D tokens over time. So this is our prediction. And next, I'm going to show you the result. So if this is the case, then the improvement for the D category will be used as evidence for adaptation. And this is what we observed. As predicted, we found a three-way interaction between group, namely L1 or L2 accented exposure, test block, and category, namely DOT. And the interaction was driven by greater improvement for D categories in the L2 accented exposure group relative to the other group. And there was no significant difference for the T categories. So if we look at this AND block, the last block, right, this just replicate what we know from the traditional paradigm where there was only one test towards the end. Now, we now showed that even with this brief test phase, we can detect adaptation. Now, the question is, what happens over a more extended period of time? What if listeners have repeated the exposure over time? This will simulate the sort of real world experiences that listeners may have if they repeatedly encounter some talkers whose input may be a priori unfamiliar to them. So for this study experiment, we recruited participants from Prolific, and we had exactly the same stimuli from experiment 1 and the same setup, except that now instead of one single session, the participants went through 5 sessions. So it's the same setup repeated, conducted on day 1 and then repeated on the next day, and then 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. So we will have more data from each participant. The hypothesis that we entertained first is that listeners may not be able to retain the adaptive changes over time, such that they will reset every single time, meaning every time they come back, they will go back to baseline, even though we will be able to see within session changes. Alternatively, maybe it's the case that improvement is cumulative, that the listeners will be able to continuously benefit from this repeated exposure, in the sense that every time they come back, they will start with a higher baseline. And then over time, they will be able to benefit from this repeated exposure to a greater extent than from a single session experiment. So these were 2 hypotheses that we entertained. Now I'm going to show you the result. This would result from the L2 accented exposure condition. And as we see, there was improvement over the entire course of the experiment, right? The participants' recognition of D increased over time, and this is a continuous process. So this suggests that they do not reset every single time. But what was surprising to us is that we observed a similar pattern for the L1 accented group. Even though they did not hear the critical D tokens from the Mandarin accented talker, they somehow also demonstrated improvement over this extended period of time. So this was puzzling. We conducted a series of follow-up experiments trying to understand this result. And this is again just showing the results side by side from the single session and the multi-day experiment. Just to recap, both of these studies showed the signature patterns by the end of the last block. The question is, what led to the unexpected improvement in the L1 accented exposure group on the right? So we did a series of follow-up experiments. First, we asked, well, is it possible that we are looking at different populations because the very first experiment was was using participants recruited from campus, where the second was from Prolific. So we replicate the very first experiment using Prolific population, and this is experiment 1B. Comparing these 2 experiments, what we saw is using the Prolific population, we basically replicated what we saw for the 1-month version, namely the L1 accented exposure group here. This is the control group. They also showed improvements. This is in contrast with the experiment 1A, where there was an interaction between condition and the test block and sound category. So tentatively speaking, we did observe different patterns from these 2 populations, right? Okay, so the second experiment that we conducted was to see whether there was anything during exposure phase that could have lead to the improvement in the IL-1 accented group, even though they did not hear the critical D. So what we did is to compare this experiment to another experiment where the listeners actually did not hear any L2 accented speech at all. So they listened to L1 accented speech without D tokens. And what we found is even with this type of control, the participants still showed improvement over time. Okay. So lastly, we turn to another possibility. Maybe because we now have repeated tests, this was not traditionally done in a single exposure test paradigm. Maybe listeners can learn from the test tokens, even without a critical exposure to the D tokens during the exposure phase. So what we did is we conducted another study where instead of presenting the minimal pairs during test, we present only one member within the minimal pair to the participants. For instance, if the participants have heard feed, they will not hear feed during the test phase. And what we observed is when we do this, there was actually a significant effect of group, meaning only participants who heard the critical D sounds during exposure phase showed a benefit. Okay, so together with this, I'm gonna wrap up this study. What we've seen is on the one hand, the in the moment adaptive changes incrementally occurred within a single session. And over a month's time, repeated exposure led to cumulative adaptive changes. The adaptation did not reset every single time, but we also saw that participants who did not hear L2 accented D during exposure were able to learn from the test tokens when minimal pairs were present. And when these were taken away, then we observed the classic finding, which is L2 accented D tokens yielded additional advantages. And on top of that, we also observed that the campus population seemed to show greater sensitivity to short-term exposure effects compared to the prolific population, in the sense that even when the minimal pairs were present at test, the L2 accented exposure group showed additional benefit over the L1 extended exposure group for this population. So what we are doing right now is to run more participants using this population to see if this result holds up. If it does, great, then we replicate the same pattern across platforms. But if it doesn't, then it does raise a question why we observe this difference. And this is something I would love to hear the thoughts from the audience about. And the second thing we're doing right now is to run the 1 month version of the last experiment where no minimal pairs were presented at the test, and we want to see whether the kind of incremental changes would occur over the entire course of 1 month. Right. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn to the last study. The second study investigates the interplay between short-term exposure and long-term experience. So let me start by asking you consider two cases. Let's consider two speakers. One person, Danielle, speaks English only, grows up in a household where only American English is spoken, and lives in Southern California. Goes to Chinese restaurants every week. And Holly, who speaks English only, grows up in a household in which only American English is spoken, living in Central Montana, and has few interactions outside of her own culture, right? So let me ask you two questions. A, who do you think has an easier time understanding Mandarin accented talker in the initial encounter? And second, do you think they can adapt to a novel accented talker equally rapidly or not? Okay, you might be seeing where I'm going with this. Despite the fact that Daniela and Holly may have very distinct social linguistic experience, in their daily life, they are often treated as the same homogeneous group, aka monolinguals, right? This is pretty common even in the studies that aim to assess how short-term exposure changes the way we process language, as in the kind of studies I described to you up to this point. And the assumption is that all monolingual speakers behave in the same way. But on the other hand, our intuition may tell us something different, which is individual variation in long-term linguistic experience matters. And this is one of the key insights we got from the modeling work as well. Depending on what kind of prior expectations that listeners have, they will perceive the same token in different ways, and this will further interact with the short-term exposure. But we don't have a lot of empirical evidence for that. There are some studies that showed self-reported familiarity seem to change the way we adapt to unfamiliar input, but we don't have a good systematic understanding of how this works in general. So in this study, our goal is to predict the adaptivity of speech perception based on listeners' daily exposure to diverse linguistic input. And to do this, we applied geolocation-based recruitment, where we use the census data and extract statistics about the number of monolingual speaking households in the region, as well as other metrics that we can use to classify regions into different levels of social linguistic diversity. So the participants were recruited again from Prolific, and they met this criteria. Importantly, all of the participants were monolingual speakers. They have no regular exposure to other languages or other accents of English, and they have lived in the same states for the last 5 years, right? So based on the census data, we pre-classified the states in the United States into linguistically diverse versus homogeneous regions, depending on two metrics. One is the number of English-only speaking households. The other is the number of Chinese-speaking households. So we use the latter because, again, in the study, we look at how listeners perceive and adapt to Mandarin accented English. And we don't have direct estimates for accent exposure per se. We hope by looking at the number of Chinese-speaking households in the region, we can get a first approximation to estimate this aspect. So this is where our participants come from. This is a relatively large-scale study. We have nearly 800 participants, and our participants come from these different states, pre-classified as either diverse or linguistically homogeneous. We intentionally remove the subjects from metropolitan areas as well as southern states, where the southern variety can change the way the listeners have for their prior expectations. So in addition to this, we also extracted the zip code level statistics within each region. For instance, for California, we have zip code level of the metrics that we're interested in. But it's important to note that even for California, where we had almost 200 participants, as we can see, we don't have a lot of participants from each zip code, right? So the sampling remain pretty sparse. But this is already a scale that's much larger than typical studies that look at adaptation. So in this study, we have two hypotheses in response to the two questions I posed to you. On the one hand, we hypothesize that listeners who reside in a linguistically diverse region, they will demonstrate enhanced perception of non-native accented speech to begin with. And on the other hand, we expect them to show greater benefits from the short-term exposure that we exposed them to in the brief paradigm. So in this study, we use a different paradigm, which is something that we used previously. We use a cross-modal matching task to measure speech recognition performance. So we ask listeners of English to listen to one sentence at a time, and then they need to answer whether the last word of the auditory sentence matches the printed word on the screen or not. And we measure their response time in this task. One group of participants will listen to a native speaker of English, while another group listen to a Mandarin accent speaker's voice. So initially, as we've shown here, those who are in the accented speech condition will respond with a slower pace. But by the time that they complete just 18 trials of exposure, they were almost as fast as those who are listening to the native speech, right? So this just demonstrates rapid adaptation again. But interestingly, only those who got exposed to the accented talker will generalize this exposure benefit to a novel talker of the same Mandarin accent. And furthermore, we know that this is not a matter of just adapting to any difficult listening condition, because if listeners listen to native accented speech embedded in noise, which is equally challenging, as we see from the reaction times during the exposure phase, they will not show the same benefit during test. So in other words, only listeners who have the specific L2 accent exposure will be able to generalize that experience at the test phase when they hear speech from a novel talker. So we use this paradigm in this study, and we compare the performance during the test phase and see whether subjects in both conditions perform in the same way or not. So the noise condition here means listeners heard native speech in noise, and this is a condition that serves as a strict control. And in addition to the exposure and test phases, we have a practice block at the beginning and a baseline block at the end. This will help us to control for the baseline differences in response in reaction time. So this is the number that we had in each region and in each condition. We are still running this study, so take the result with a grain of salt. All right. So what I'm showing you here are the reaction times over the course of exposure from both types of regions, diverse and linguistically homogeneous regions. And what we saw was that there was a main effect of a trial, meaning everybody got better over the course of exposure, regardless which region they were from, and regardless which condition they were in. This is just evidence for adaptation. But there was no effective region, nor was there any interaction. Now let's turn to the test phase. So when we look at the test data, we first observed that those who were in a noise condition, they showed a greater reaction time compared to the accent condition. This again just replicated the classic adaptation effects, right? But crucially, again, here we ask whether there was an effective region or not, and there was none, right? So this is to see the kind of objective estimates of accent exposure as at least as currently assessed at the state level does not seem to explain the data very well. Now let's turn to a more fine-grained metric of accent exposure. So we use the zip code level statistics, and for each person, we derive the CH prevalence metric as an index for individual variation in accent exposure. So this is basically the proportion of Mandarin-speaking households in the zip code where a participant resides in. And we include this as a predictor and redid the same analysis, basically replacing the region with CH prevalence. Again, for exposure, we found no effect of CH prevalence. For the test phase, we now see a marginal effect of CH prevalence, but it did not interact with condition. All right, so to summarize this part of the results, on the one hand, we again replicated prior work and found that short-term exposure led to improved recognition of non-native accented speech. But to our surprise, this worked similarly for all individuals, regardless of where they reside in. So in other words, the geographic location-based estimates of accent exposure does not seem to affect the adaptation process. And we think there are two possibilities for the lack of effect here. On the one hand, it's possible that the individual metric that we use does not have enough gradients. And another possibility is that this metric still does not capture the rich sociolinguistic experiences that listeners have. So in ongoing work, what we are doing is to examine the interplay between short-term exposure and long-term experience in other accents. As we can see here, on the left side, we have the zip code level statistics of Mandarin or Chinese prevalence across the zip codes within California. There is not a lot of gradients, but on the right, when we turn to the Spanish language, there is greater gradients, right? We hope to replicate this study in Spanish accented English and see whether this metric would be able to account for individual variation in adaptivity of speech perception or not. And at the same time, we want to have another way to more dynamically assess the daily exposure to various types of accents of English. So what we are currently exploring is experience sampling method, where we send text messages to survey listeners about their experience on the go, and by asking them questions. For instance, questions like, in the past hour, did you talk to anybody? And if so, what kind of accents they have? So by doing this, we hope to gain a better idea of the kind of experience they have from moment to moment without leaving them a lot of memory burden. And we refer this to as the survey of non-native accent perception. And we hope that with this SNAP survey and in combination with the census data and traditional questionnaire data, we'll have a better way to characterize the rich individual variation in terms of the long-term sociolinguistic diversity that listeners may get from the environment. And hopefully this will help us to answer the question, how does short-term exposure interact with the long-term experience, and therefore a priori expectations to change the way we perceive speech signal and the way we adapt to unfamiliar input. And with that, I would like to thank you all for listening and thank my collaborators who have contributed to the work I presented here.